Louisiana, 1945. The train slowed to a crawl under a sky heavy with moisture, the air thick enough to taste. Through the boxcar slats, German women pressed their faces against the wood, watching the platform approach. They had been told what to expect: savagery, humiliation, chains. What they saw instead made them freeze. Black soldiers in American uniforms stood in perfect formation, rifles at ease, faces impassive under the brutal sun. For a moment, no one breathed. Everything they had been taught, everything they believed about race, about America, about war itself, was about to shatter. The journey had begun 3 weeks earlier on a gray morning in northern France. Greta Hoffmann stood among 200 women in a makeshift holding camp outside Cherbourg, her Red Cross armband still visible beneath layers of road dust. She was 32, a nurse who had treated Wehrmacht soldiers in field hospitals from Poland to Normandy. Around her, teachers, factory workers, telephone operators, even a violinist from Hamburg, all captured as the Allied advance swept through occupied territory. They had expected execution. The propaganda had been clear. Americans showed no mercy, especially to women who had served the Reich. Instead, they received medical examinations, delousing powder, and gray cotton dresses stamped with PW in black paint. The letters felt like brands. The ship crossing was worse than fear. Seasickness, darkness, the constant roll of waves beneath steel decks. Women prayed in whispers, clutching photographs of children they might never see again. Greta kept a diary, hiding it in her sleeve, writing by moonlight through portholes. March 12, 1945. We are told we go to America. I cannot imagine what America will do to us. The Louisiana heat hit them like a wall when the ship doors opened in New Orleans. Not the dry heat of summer Germany, but something wet and alive, pressing against skin, filling lungs with thickness. Palm trees swayed against a sky impossibly blue. Women stumbled down gangplanks, blinking in light that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Black soldiers lined the dock. This was the first shock. In Nazi Germany, black people existed only in propaganda films, caricatures of savagery, evidence of American degeneracy, proof that democracy led to racial chaos. The women had been shown documentaries claiming black soldiers raped and murdered across France. One propaganda poster Greta remembered showed a gorilla in an American uniform, captioned, "This is what liberates you." But these men stood motionless, professional. Their uniforms were pressed despite the heat, weapons held loosely, no threat in their posture. One soldier, his skin dark as tobacco leaves, helped an older German woman who stumbled on the gangplank. His hand was gentle. Greta watched this and felt something crack in her understanding of the world. The transport trucks were open-sided, allowing air to move as they drove north through country unlike anything the women had seen. Endless flatness, broken only by strange trees draped in gray moss that hung like spectral curtains. Water everywhere, swamps, bayous, rivers the color of rust. A landscape that felt both beautiful and dangerous, alive with sounds they couldn't identify. "Where are they taking us?" Lisa Muller whispered in German. She was 19, a telephone operator from Munich, still young enough to believe rescue might come. No one answered. The black soldiers driving the trucks didn't speak to them, but their silence wasn't cruel. They simply drove, occasionally passing water canteens back when the heat became unbearable. One soldier, noticing a woman about to faint, stopped the convoy in shade until she recovered. These small acts confused the prisoners more than cruelty would have. The camp emerged from piney woods like something from a fever dream. Rows of white wooden barracks stretched across cleared land, surrounded by wire fences that seemed almost decorative compared to the concrete and steel of German camps. Guard towers stood at intervals, but the guards inside read newspapers, smoked, looked bored. The camp commander was a black captain named Robert Hayes. This fact alone would have been impossible to explain to anyone back in Germany. A black man commanding white prisoners, holding absolute authority over their lives. He stood on the camp headquarters steps as the trucks arrived, his uniform immaculate, his face revealing nothing. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention," he said through a translator. His voice was steady, formal. "You will work. You will be paid. You will be fed. You will not be harmed. Follow the rules, and you will find life here tolerable." The German women stood in formation, sun beating down, trying to process these words. Paid, fed, not harmed? It had to be a trick, some elaborate American deception before the real treatment began. Captain Hayes dismissed them to their barracks. The buildings were simple but clean. Wooden bunks, thin mattresses, lockers for personal items they didn't have. Screens on windows kept insects out. Fans moved air, though the heat remained oppressive. In the corner of each barracks, a radio played American music. Big band jazz, voices singing in English about moonlight and romance. "This is how they break you," an older woman named Frau Kessler muttered. "With comfort, with kindness, then comes the punishment." But the punishment never came. Morning came early. 5 a.m. roll call in the compound yard, mist still hanging in the trees, the world gray and soft before the heat arrived. Black guards counted the women with methodical precision, then directed them to the mess hall. This was where the second great shock occurred. The mess hall was a long wooden building with screened windows and rows of tables. Women filed in, expecting watery soup, stale bread, the starvation rations that defined wartime Europe. Instead, they found trays loaded with scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, butter, coffee with real cream. Greta stared at her plate as if it might vanish. Around her, women sat frozen, afraid to touch the food. One woman began to cry silently, tears cutting lines through the dust on her face. A black soldier serving the line noticed their hesitation. He spoke no German, but his gesture was universal. He mimed eating, smiled slightly, moved on to the next woman. Permission granted. The women ate like they were trying to remember what it meant to be human. Some became sick from eating too fast after months of near starvation. Others ate slowly, deliberately, each bite a small ceremony. The bacon was salty, rich with fat. The eggs were hot and soft. The coffee was bitter and perfect. In Germany, people were eating potato peels and sawdust bread. Here, prisoners ate better than German civilians. The work assignments came after breakfast. Some women were sent to the camp laundry, others to the kitchens, still others to maintenance crews. The labor was real but not crushing. 8-hour shifts with breaks. Water provided constantly because of the heat. Supervisors who corrected mistakes without cruelty. And everywhere, black soldiers, guarding, working, living alongside the camp in their own barracks. The women watched them obsessively, trying to reconcile propaganda with reality. These men played baseball in the evenings, their laughter carrying across the compound. They wrote letters home in the shade of pine trees. They sang while working, harmonies that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and profound. One soldier carved wooden toys during his breaks, horses, dogs, tiny birds with wings spread wide. Nothing matched what the women had been taught. Greta made a friend among the guards. Not truly a friend, boundaries remained, but something like mutual respect. His name was Sergeant James Wilson, a man from Georgia with hands scarred from farm work and eyes that seemed to see more than he said. He had fought in North Africa and Italy before being assigned to guard duty, recovering from wounds that left him with a slight limp. He caught her writing in her diary one evening, sitting under a pine tree while fireflies pulsed in the gathering darkness. "You documenting our cruelty?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of humor. Greta looked up, startled. Her English was limited, but she understood the tone. "No cruelty," she said carefully. "That is the problem." Wilson sat down on a nearby bench, not too close, respecting the invisible line between guard and prisoner. "What did they tell you about us? About black folks in America?" She hesitated, then decided truth was safer than lies. "They said you were not human, dangerous, that you would rape and murder?" Wilson finished. His voice was flat, tired, as if he'd had this conversation before. "Yeah, we heard what y'all were told. But it's not true." "No, ma'am, it's not true." They sat in silence for a moment, listening to the night sounds. Crickets, distant voices from the camp, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Why do you guard us? Greta asked. Why not white soldiers? Wilson's laugh was short, bitter. White soldiers for white prisoners, they figured. Black soldiers for the ones nobody cares about as much. POW duty ain't glory work. But you fought. You were wounded. Yes, ma'am. Fought for a country that won't let me vote back home. Fought for freedom while my mama still rides in the back of the bus. He paused, then added, but I fought and I'll keep fighting because it's right. This answer was more complicated than Greta could fully process. A man fighting for a country that oppressed him, guarding prisoners from a country that had tried to exterminate anyone not pure Aryan. The moral mathematics didn't compute according to any equation she'd been taught. In Germany, she said slowly, they would have killed you, just for existing. I know. And yet you don't kill us. No, ma'am. That's the difference between us and them. That night, Greta wrote in her diary, I begin to understand that we were lied to about everything. Not just small lies, but lies so large they built an entire world. And now that world is collapsing, and I don't know what to believe instead. The transformation didn't happen all at once. It came in small moments, accumulating like water wearing away stone. A guard named Private Marcus Brown taught some of the younger German women to play baseball in the evenings. He was patient, demonstrating the grip, the swing, laughing when they missed, celebrating when they connected. His joy was infectious, uncomplicated. Lisa Mueller, the 19-year-old from Munich, asked him why he was kind to them. You're people, he said simply. Being a prisoner don't change that. In the camp library, yes, they had a library, women discovered American newspapers, magazines, books. They read about the concentration camps being liberated, saw photographs their minds initially rejected. Greta stared at images from Bergen-Belsen for 3 hours, trembling, before she finally accepted they were real. We didn't know, became a phrase repeated like a prayer. We didn't know about the camps. But some of them had known, or had chosen not to know, or had known and decided it wasn't their concern. The guilt settled over the barracks like humidity, heavy, inescapable, exhausting. The black soldiers never lectured them about it, never gloated. They simply existed, going about their duties with quiet dignity that served as its own lesson. These men who had every reason to hate because of Germany's racial ideology, because of America's own racism, chose instead a kind of professional compassion. One evening in late May, a terrible storm rolled through Louisiana. Thunder like artillery fire, lightning that turned the world white, rain so heavy it seemed the sky was emptying all its contents at once. The barracks leaked, women huddled on their bunks, some whimpering, remembering bombing raids. The black guards came through the storm, checking each barracks, moving women to drier buildings, bringing blankets and hot coffee. Sergeant Wilson found Greta sitting alone in darkness, shaking. Reminds you of the war? He asked gently. She nodded, unable to speak. He sat down at a respectful distance. It's just a storm. You're safe here. Why? The word burst from her. Why do you care if we're safe? We were your enemies. We believed terrible things about you. Why don't you just let us suffer? Wilson was quiet for a long time, the rain hammering on the roof, the world outside lost in darkness and water. Finally, he said, because somebody has to stop the cycle. Somebody has to choose different. Maybe that's the only way any of this ever gets better. Greta cried then, really cried for the first time since her capture. Not from fear or exhaustion, but from the grief of understanding how thoroughly she had been deceived, how much had been lost in the service of lies. Wilson sat with her until the storm passed. In June, the Red Cross established mail service to and from Germany. Women could write home, send word that they were alive. The letters they received back painted a picture of devastation. Cities destroyed, families scattered, starvation widespread, the economy collapsed, and refugees, millions of refugees flooding west, fleeing the Soviet advance. Stories of what was happening in the Soviet occupation zone made the Louisiana heat seem like mercy. Greta's letter from her sister in Hamburg described eating grass to survive, prostituting herself to British soldiers for a can of beans, watching children die of dysentery in the streets. The letter ended. You are lucky to be in America. At least the Americans are human. This created a strange psychological inversion. The women in Camp Concordia ate 3 meals a day, slept in beds, received medical care. They were safer and healthier than their families back home. Being a prisoner of war in America was better than being free in Germany. The guilt from this realization was almost unbearable. Some women, like Frau Kessler, clung to the old ideology, insisting this was all temporary, that Germany would rise again, that the Jews had deserved what happened. But her voice grew smaller each week, drowned out by evidence, by reality, by the simple fact that the world she had believed in was ash. Most women went through a different transformation. They began to ask questions, to learn, to reconsider everything they had been taught. The camp had a German-language newspaper created by POWs from other camps, articles discussing denazification, democracy, rebuilding. Women read these papers obsessively, arguing late into the night about what Germany should become. And always, the Black Guards were present. Living contradictions to Nazi ideology. Proof that propaganda was poison. In July, something remarkable happened. A group of black soldiers in the camp formed a jazz band. They had a saxophone player named Leon Davis who could make his instrument sound like it was crying or laughing or praying, all at once. A pianist named Thomas Reed whose fingers moved over keys like water. A drummer who kept time like a heartbeat. They performed in the camp square on a Saturday evening as the heat finally broke and the sky turned purple and gold. The German women were invited to attend. At first, they sat stiffly on the benches provided, uncertain what to expect. The music began, something up-tempo, full of brass and rhythm, notes tumbling over each other in joyful chaos. Then it shifted to something slower, bluer, a melody that seemed to contain all the sadness in the world transformed into beauty. Greta watched Leon Davis play, his eyes closed, sweat on his face, his entire being focused on the music. She had heard jazz before, in propaganda films where it was presented as degenerate noise, evidence of cultural decay. But this wasn't noise. This was art, complex and sophisticated, requiring incredible skill and feeling. This was music created by people the Reich had declared subhuman. The cognitive dissonance was total and complete. Some of the younger women began to sway slightly to the rhythm. Lisa Mueller was openly crying, though she couldn't have explained why. The music seemed to reach past language, past ideology, straight to something fundamental about being human. When the concert ended, the women applauded. Hesitantly at first, then genuinely. Leon Davis opened his eyes, saw them clapping, and nodded slightly. No smile, no grand gesture, just acknowledgement. That night, more than a dozen women wrote in their diaries about the concert. Greta wrote, "Today I heard the music of people we were taught to despise. It was more beautiful than anything I heard in Berlin. What does this mean? What does any of it mean?" August brought news of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, of Japan's surrender, of the war finally, truly ending. In Camp Concordia, this meant uncertainty. What would happen to the German prisoners now? Would they be sent home to the ruins? Kept in America? Tried for war crimes? The anxiety rippled through the barracks. Some women hoped to stay, afraid of what waited in Germany. Others desperately wanted to return despite everything, to find family, to start rebuilding. Captain Hayes called an assembly in the camp square. He stood on a platform, the sun brutal overhead, his uniform showing dark patches of sweat. The women stood in formation, waiting. "The war is over," he said, and the translator rendered his words into German. "You will be repatriated over the coming months. The process will take time. Until then, camp operations continue as before." He paused, looking out over the assembled women. "I want you to understand something. When you return to Germany, you will tell people about your time here. Some won't believe you. Some will say you're lying or that you've been brainwashed. But I need you to tell the truth anyway." The women listened, silent. "Tell them that black soldiers guarded you and did not harm you. Tell them that America, for all its flaws, and Lord knows we have many, still chose to treat you with basic human dignity. Tell them that the ideology that brought you here was built on lies. Tell them that different races can live together, work together, even make music together. His voice grew stronger. Your government tried to exterminate entire peoples. Millions dead in camps, in gas chambers, in mass graves. That is what happens when you believe some humans are less than others. That is what happens when you let hate guide policy. The silence was absolute. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing. We're sending you home to rebuild. Don't rebuild the same world. Build something better. Build something that recognizes the humanity in every person, regardless of color, religion, or origin. That's the only way any of this matters. That's the only way those millions didn't die for nothing. Captain Hayes stepped down from the platform. The assembly was dismissed. That evening, Greta sought out Sergeant Wilson. She found him sitting under their usual pine tree, smoking a cigarette, watching fireflies begin their evening dance. "I need to tell you something," she said in careful English. He gestured to the bench. She sat, searching for words. "When I was in Germany, I knew about the camps. Not everything, but something. I knew Jews were being sent away. I knew they weren't coming back. I told myself it wasn't my concern. I told myself the government must have reasons. I told myself many lies to avoid facing the truth." She paused, tears starting. "And I believed what they said about black people. I believed you were inferior, dangerous, not fully human. I believed this easily because it made me feel superior, because it gave me someone to look down on." Wilson listened, his face unreadable. "I cannot undo what I believed. I cannot undo what my country did. But I want you to know that I see now. I see what we were, what I was. And I am more ashamed than I have words for." The silence stretched. A firefly landed on the bench between them, pulsing its cold light, then flew away into darkness. "Hate is easy," Wilson said finally. "It's the laziest emotion there is. You just point at somebody different and blame them for everything wrong in your life. Don't have to think, don't have to question, don't have to look at your own failings." He took a drag on his cigarette, the ember glowing. "Love is harder, respect is harder. Seeing the humanity in everybody, even people who don't look like you, that takes work. That takes courage." "Do you forgive me?" Greta asked, her voice barely a whisper. Wilson looked at her directly. "That's not for me to decide. The people who died in those camps, the ones who suffered under your government, they're the ones you need forgiveness from. And most of them are gone. Then what do I do?" "You live different. You teach different. When you go home and people start talking about the old ways, the old beliefs, you speak up. You say no. You say I've seen another way and it's better. You become the kind of person who would have hidden Jews in her attic instead of pretending not to notice." He stood to leave, then paused. "You asked me once why we don't just let you suffer. It's because we believe people can change. We believe you can learn. We believe that even after everything, there's still a chance to build something better. Don't make us wrong about that." Repatriation began in October. Groups of women were processed, given paperwork, loaded onto trucks heading back to New Orleans, then onto ships heading to Europe. Greta's group was scheduled for early November. The last days in Camp Concordia felt strange. Women wandered the compound, trying to memorize it, understanding they were about to leave safety for chaos. Germany was a destroyed nation occupied by foreign powers, its cities rubble, its economy collapsed, its future uncertain. On the final evening, many of the guards and prisoners gathered in the camp square. There was no official ceremony, just people saying goodbye. Some women shook hands with their guards. A few hugged. Most simply nodded, acknowledging what had passed between them. Lisa Mueller approached Private Marcus Brown, the soldier who had taught her baseball. She had learned enough English to say, "Thank you for showing me kindness." He smiled. "You take care of yourself over there. Build something good." Greta found Sergeant Wilson one last time. They stood under the pine tree where they had talked so many times, fireflies beginning their dance, the Louisiana evening turning soft and purple. "I will remember this place," she said. I will remember what you taught me. Remember what you learned, he corrected gently. I just stood witness while you figured it out yourself. Will you remember me? He considered this. I'll remember that people can change, that even after everything there's hope. That's what I'll carry. They shook hands, formally, the gesture carrying weight beyond its simplicity. The next morning, trucks came before dawn. Women loaded their few possessions, some clothes, letters from home, and diaries filled with observations that would have been impossible to imagine a year before. They filed out of the camp gates, past the guard towers, past the wire fences that had held them. Captain Hayes stood at the gate saluting as they passed, a small gesture but significant. Respect offered even to defeated enemies. The ship back to Europe carried 600 German POWs, men and women from various camps. During the crossing, they told stories, compared experiences, tried to prepare for what awaited. Some men had been in camps where brutality was common, where guards were cruel, where conditions were harsh. They were bitter, unchanged, ready to resurrect the old ideology as soon as possible. But the women from Camp Concordia told different stories. Stories of black soldiers who had treated them with dignity. Stories of being fed, housed, respected. Stories of learning that everything they had been taught was a lie. Some of the men didn't believe them, called them traitors, brainwashed, weak. But others listened, thoughtful, perhaps beginning their own reconsideration. Greta stood at the ship's rail as the coast of France appeared, gray and cold under November skies. Beside her, Lisa Mueller shivered in her thin coat. Are you afraid? Lisa asked. Yes, but not of what I was afraid of before. What do you mean? Greta watched the coastline grow closer. Before, I was afraid of punishment, of suffering, of death. Now I'm afraid I won't be strong enough to live differently, that I'll go home and the old ways will be easier, and I'll fall back into them. Then we help each other, Lisa said. We remember together. We remind each other what we learned. The ship docked in Cherbourg, the same port where their journey had begun. But they were different women now. They had crossed an ocean, lived among people they'd been taught to fear and hate, and learned that humanity could survive even the worst ideology. In the years after the war, Greta Hoffmann became a teacher in Hamburg. She taught history, but not the sanitized version. She taught about the camps, about the war crimes, about what happens when hate becomes policy, and she told her students about Louisiana, about black soldiers who guarded German prisoners with dignity, about learning that race meant nothing compared to character. Some parents complained, some called her a traitor, but others listened. And slowly, the next generation began to learn different lessons than their parents had. Lisa Muller married an American soldier she met during the occupation and moved to Georgia. She lived 3 streets away from Sergeant James Wilson's family. Their children played together. When old neighbors in Germany wrote asking how she could live among black people, she wrote back, "Because they're just people. Because everything we were taught was a lie. Because there is no master race, there is only the human race." Captain Robert Hayes continued serving in the Army, fighting through Korea, eventually retiring as a colonel. He never spoke publicly about his time commanding POW camps, but he kept letters from some of the German women, letters thanking him, letters describing their new lives, letters proving that people could change. Sergeant Wilson returned to Georgia and became a school teacher, then a principal, then a civil rights activist during the 1960s. When asked what gave him faith that hearts could change, that racism could be defeated, he told the story of German women in a Louisiana camp who learned to see past propaganda to humanity. What happened in Camp Concordia and places like it was not widely known for decades. It didn't fit comfortable narratives. It was too complex, too nuanced, too much at odds with simple stories of good versus evil. But it was real. German POWs, including women, were held in camps across America during the final years of the war. Many were guarded by black soldiers, particularly in the South where racial segregation meant black troops were often assigned to duties white commanders considered less important. And those encounters between women who had been taught that black people were subhuman and soldiers who showed them dignity anyway, became a small part of denazification. Not the official program of lectures and films, but something more personal. The simple experience of having your deepest prejudices contradicted by daily reality. Historians later noted that German POWs held in America returned home with complicated perspectives. They had seen a country that was simultaneously racist, Jim Crow was in full force, and more equitable than Nazi Germany. They had experienced the contradiction of black soldiers who served a nation that oppressed them, yet still chose honor over revenge. These experiences didn't instantly create anti-racists, but they planted seeds of doubt about totalitarian ideology. They proved that propaganda could be overcome by direct human contact. They demonstrated that even enemies could be treated with basic decency, and that such treatment could transform understanding. The camp where Greta Hoffman spent 9 months no longer exists. The barracks were torn down. The land returned to farming. If you visited the site today, you would see only fields, perhaps a historical marker noting that a POW camp once stood there. But the impact of what happened in that space ripples forward. Every student Greta taught about facing truth instead of comfortable lies. Every child Lisa raised to judge people by character rather than color. Every person who heard these stories and chose to see the humanity in everyone. The German women who encountered Black American soldiers for the first time expected monsters. They found men. They expected cruelty. They found professionalism. They expected confirmation of their prejudices. They found evidence that everything they believed was wrong. And in that gap between expectation and reality, something extraordinary happened. Not dramatic, not cinematic, but real. People changed their minds. People learned to see differently. People chose to build their lives on new foundations. That is the quiet victory that no army can achieve. That is the transformation that happens one person at a time, one conversation at a time, one moment of recognition that the enemy is human too. In the end, it wasn't American military might that defeated Nazism in those women's hearts. It wasn't re-education programs or denazification lectures. It was the simple experience of being treated with dignity by people they had been taught to despise. That is the lesson that echoes across decades. That is the truth that survives when all the propaganda is forgotten. That is the hope that remains when everything else has been destroyed. Humanity is not determined by race, nation, or ideology. It is chosen daily in small acts of decency. It is proven by how we treat those we have power over. It is built by people who, having every reason to hate, choose something better instead. The women who left Camp Concordia in November 1945 carried that lesson home with them, back to a destroyed nation that needed to learn it more than anything else. Some shared it, some lived it, some passed it on to children and grandchildren, and somewhere in that chain of transformation, the world became slightly better than it was. Not perfect, not redeemed, but better, and better is enough to build on.